The castle diner was always empty after midnight, but that night she stayed late. A storm was breaking outside, and the boy at the corner table still hadn't finished his meal. He looked fragile, pale skin, silver eyes, hands trembling as he tried to lift the spoon. Every few seconds, it slipped from his fingers and clattered against the plate. The waitress sighed softly and walked over. "Let me help," she said. No one ever touched him. No one ever dared, but she did. She scooped the soup carefully, lifted it to his lips, and smiled when he took it. For the first time, the boy didn't look like he looked human. What she didn't know was that someone was watching. From the shadows above the grand staircase, the vampire king himself. He had watched humans for centuries, greedy, cruel, afraid. But tonight, one mortal girl's kindness reached where even immortality could not. Stay with me until the end. Because what the king did next would not only change her fate, it would alter the balance between darkness and light forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let us get into it. Rain hammered against the tall Gothic windows of Castle Ravencroft, turning ancient glass into a web of streaming water. Thunder rolled across the moors, shaking the very stones of the fortress that had stood for 800 years. Most nights, the castle diner closed at 10 sharp. Its few human staff eager to escape before the darker residents began to stir. But tonight was different. Tonight, Elliot wiped down tables with practiced efficiency, her worn apron damp in the humid air that seeped through the stone walls. She had been working at the castle for 3 months now, ever since the old diner in town burned down and left her with nowhere else to go. The pay was decent, the work honest, and if the location was a bit unusual, well, she had learned not to ask too many questions about her employers. The boy in the corner booth hadn't moved in over an hour. His name was Aiden, though she had only learned that from overhearing whispered conversations between the other staff members. He came down every night at exactly 11:30, ordered the same meal, chicken soup, plain bread, water, and sat in the same spot facing the Great Hall essence. Elia had watched him struggle night after night. His thin fingers could barely grip the silverware, his movements slow and labored. The other staff members gave him a wide berth, their eyes filled with things that like fear mixed with pity. They would set his meal down quickly and retreat, leaving him to manage alone. But tonight, as the storm raged outside and the candles flickered in their iron sconces, Elia couldn't stand anymore. She set down her clean cloth and walked over to his table, her footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. Eden looked up at her with those startling silver eyes, and for a moment, she saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe even hope. "You don't have to," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Everyone says I'm cursed. They're probably right." Elenina pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Well, I've never been much for listening to what everyone says." She reached for the spoon that had fallen beside his bowl. "Besides, we all need help sometimes." She lifted the spoon, filled it with the cooling broth, and brought it carefully to his lips. Aden hesitated for just a moment before accepting it, his eyes never leaving her face. As she continued to feed him, she noticed the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, the frightened look in his eyes soften into something warmer. "What's your name?" he asked between spoonfuls. "Elia," she replied, offering him a gentle smile. "And I already know you're Aiden." He nodded slowly. "They told you about me, didn't they? About what's wrong with me?" Elna paused, considering her words carefully. "They told me you need help sometimes. That's not wrong. That's just human." Something shifted in Aiden's expression at those words. For the first time since she had started working here, she saw him truly smile. What Elia didn't know was that high above them, standing in the shadows of the grand staircase's carved balustrade, someone indeed watching. Kale, the Vamp King, had ruled these lands for over 6 centuries. He had seen empires rise and fall, witnessed humanity at its best and its absolute worst. In all those years, he had learned to expect disappointment from mortals. His son Aiden was evidence of that disappointment. Born from a brief union with a mortal woman centuries ago, the boy carried both vampire and human blood in his veins. But instead of granting him the best of both worlds, the mixture had left him weak, sickly, caught between two natures that were within his small frame. Lucien had tried everything to help his son. The greatest physicians, both mortal and immortal, had examined Aiden. Ancient magic, modern medicine, nothing had been able to strengthen the boy's fragile constitution. The vampire lady whispered that Aiden was an abomination, a reminder of Lucien's momentary weakness in loving a human woman. But watching Elia now, seeing the gentle way she helped his son eat, the genuine care in her movements, Lucien felt something stir in his chest that he had thought long dead. Not desire, not hunger, but something more dangerous, something like hope. He had observed the castle staff for months, watching how they treated Aiden. They were polite but distant, fulfilling their duties, but never going beyond what was required. They saw Aiden as an obligation, a reminder of their employer's strange circumstances. Elia friend. She saw Aiden as simply a boy who needed help. Lucien's enhanced hearing picked up every word of their conversation, every soft laugh that escaped Anna's lips as Elia told him stories about her life in the village below. For the first time in decades, his son seemed genuinely happy. The storm outside began to intensify, and Elia glanced toward the windows with concern. "I should probably head home soon," she murmured. "The roads will be getting dangerous." Aiden's face fell immediately. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Elia reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "Of course I will. Same time." The boy nodded eagerly, and Elia stood to clear away his empty dishes. As she worked, she hummed softly under her breath, a melody that seemed to chase away the darkness that always lingered in the castle's corners. From his position on the staircase, Lucien made a decision that would change everything. This mortal woman had given his son something that all his power and wealth could not provide: simple human kindness. And for that gift, he would ensure she never wanted for anything again. But first, he needed to understand her better. He needed to know what kind of person willingly walked into a vampire's castle each night. What drove her to show such compassion to a child that others feared to even approach. As Elia gathered the empty dishes, she noticed something strange. The other staff members who usually lingered near the kitchen entrance had vanished completely. The castle felt different tonight, quieter somehow, as if the very walls were holding their breath. She was about to head to the kitchen when a voice stopped her cold. "Miss Marchetti." Elia turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Standing at the base of the grand staircase was a man who seemed to command the very darkness around him. Tall, imposing, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that looked like it cost more than she made in here. His dark hair was swept back from a face that was both beautiful and terrifying, and his eyes were the color of fresh blood. She had never seen him before, but somehow she knew exactly who he was. The way Aiden had mentioned father in hushed tones. The way the other staff members crossed themselves when they thought no one's looking. This was Kale, the vampire king himself. Elia's first instinct was to run. Every survival instinct screamed at her to drop the dishes and bolt for the door. But something in his expression held her frozen in place. He wasn't looking at her with hunger or malice. He was looking at her with something that almost resembled curiosity. "Your Majesty," she managed, her voice barely steady. Kale moved toward her with fluid grace, each step deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice was like velvet wrapped around steel. "You stayed tonight." It wasn't a question, but Elia nodded anyway. "The storm. I wanted to make sure Aiden finished his meal properly." Something flickered in Lucien's eyes at his son's name. He stopped just a few feet away from her, close enough that she could see the otherworldly perfection of his features. The way candlelight seemed to bend around him, like he was made of shadow itself. And why would a mortal concern herself with my son's well-being? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with danger. Elia knew she was walking a razor's edge here. One word, one misstep, and she might not live to see morning. But when she thought about Aiden's smile, the way his face had lit up when she helped him, she found her courage. "Because he needed help," she said simply. "And because he's just a boy." Kale's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere around them. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. "Just a boy," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what he is, Miss Marchetti?" Do you understand what runs through his veins? Elenina lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. I know yes, your son. I know he struggles with things that come easily to others. And I know he deserves kindness regardless of what he is. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm outside seemed to pause, waiting for his response. Then, unexpectedly, Lucien smiled. It was a cold thing, beautiful and terrible at once. Interesting, he murmured. In 6 centuries, I have met perhaps 3 mortals who would dare speak to me as, you just have. 2 of them are now dust. The third, he paused, something like pain flashing across his features. The third gave me Aiden. Elena's breath caught. Aden's mother. The woman who had somehow captured the heart of a vampire king and paid the ultimate price. You loved her, Elia said softly. Kale's jaw tightened. Love is a luxury kings cannot afford. But yes, for a brief moment in my very long existence, I forgot what I was. He began to circle her slowly, like a predator studying its prey. Elia forced herself to remain still, even as every instinct told her to run. Aden is dying, Kale said matter-of-factly. The mixture of mortal and immortal blood in his veins is tearing him apart from the inside. I have consulted every physician, every healer, every witch and warlock in existence. Nothing can save him. Elenina's heart clenched. How long does he have? Months, perhaps less. Kale stopped in front of her again, his red eyes boring into hers. He will waste away slowly, growing weaker until his heart simply stops beating. Unless he let the word hang between them like a blade. Unless what? Unless he undergoes the turning full vampire transformation would purge the mortal blood from his system, make him truly immortal. But the process, Kale's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The process would destroy everything human in him. His capacity for warmth, for joy, for the very qualities that make him who he is. Elia felt tears prick her eye. So you have to choose between saving his life and saving his soul. Precisely. Kale's voice was hollow now, ancient grief weighing down every word. For months, I have been preparing to make that choice, to condemn my son to an eternity of darkness so that he might live. But tonight, watching you with him, he trailed off, turning to stare out one of the tall windows where lightning split the sky. Tonight, I saw him smile, truly smile. Not the forced politeness he chose to appease me or the other staff. For those few minutes, he looked alive in a way I haven't seen since his illness began to worsen. Elena set the dishes down on a nearby table, her hands shaking slightly. What are you saying? When Kale turned back to her, his expression was unreadable. I'm saying that you, a simple mortal waitress, accomplished something that 6 centuries of power and wealth could not. You made my dying son happy. The weight of his words settled over her like a cloak. Elenina suddenly understood why the other staff member had fled, why the castle felt so empty tonight. This wasn't a chance encounter. Kale had planned this meeting. What do you want from me? She asked. Kale moved closer, close enough that she could feel the unnatural cold that radiated from his skin. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but carried the weight of absolute command. I want you to give my son what time he has left. I want you to show him what it means to be human before that humanity is stripped away forever. Elia's mind raced. You're going to turn him. I have no choice. The pain in Kale's voice was unmistakable now. But perhaps if he experiences enough human kindness in his final mortal days, some part of that will survive the transformation. Perhaps you can teach him to hold on to pieces of what he was. She stared at him, seeing past the monster to the grieving father beneath. And what happens to me when this is over? Kale's smile turned, but this time it held no warmth at all. That depends entirely on how well you succeed. The threat was clear, but Elia found herself thinking not of her own safety, but of Aiden's silver eyes, his grateful smile when she helped him eat. A dying boy who deserved every moment of happiness she could give him. All right, she said quietly, I'll do it. Something like approval flickered in Lucien's gaze. Good. But understand this, Miss Marchetti. You are now under my protection, which means you belong to me until Aiden's transformation is complete. You will live here in the castle. You will want for nothing. And in return, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent shivers on her spine. "You will give my son a reason to remember what it felt like to be human." As if summoned by his words, thunder crashed outside and the lights flickered. When they studied, Lucien was gone, leaving Elia alone with the weight of her new reality and the distant sound of Edena's laughter going through the castle halls. She had just made a deal with the devil himself. But as she thought about the lonely boy upstairs, who needed someone to care about him, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. The real question was whether she would survive long enough to keep her end of the bargain. The next morning brought changes Elelina hadn't expected. When she arrived at the castle, her usual uniform had been replaced by clothing that felt like silk against her skin. The fabric was deep burgundy, cut in a style that was both elegant and practical. A note lay beside it, written in flowing script that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. "Your quarters have been prepared on the 3rd floor, East Wing. You will find everything you need there." No signature, but she knew who had written it. Elia made her way through corridors she had never seen before, past tapestries that seemed to move in her peripheral vision and portraits whose eyes followed her progress. The castle was vast, far larger than she had realized in her months of working in just the diner. How many secrets did these walls hold? How many other lost souls wandered these halls? Her new room took her breath away. It was 3 times the size of her tiny apartment in the village, with a 4-post bed draped in midnight blue velvet, a fireplace already crackling warmth, and windows that overlooked the moors stretching endlessly toward the horizon. On the writing desk sat a leather-bound journal and an ornate fountain pen. But what struck her most was the small detail that showed someone had been paying attention. Fresh wild flowers sat in a crystal vase by the window, the same kind she used to pick as a child and mention in the stories she told Aiden. Someone had been listening to every word. That evening when she went to the diner, Aiden was already waiting. Tonight he wasn't alone. 3 other children sat at nearby tables, each one bearing the same otherworldly beauty that marked them as something more than human. They were older than Aiden, maybe 14 or 15, with the pale skin and sharp features that spoke of vampire lineage. But unlike Adena's fragile appearance, they radiated a cold strength that made the air around them feel electric. They watched Elena with calculating eyes as she approached Adena's table. "Friends of yours?" she asked gently, settling into her usual chair across from him. Adena's silver eyes flickered with something that might have been embarrassment. "Half-siblings," he whispered. "Father thought it was time I spent more time with family." Elelina glanced at the other children, noting the way they held themselves with predatory grace, the way their eyes never quite seemed to blink. These were not children struggling with humanity. These were young vampires born to darkness and comfortableness. Mira, Cases, and Darius. Aden continued, nodding toward each in turn. "They've been away at the academy. Father called them home." The academy. Elia filed that information away, wondering what kind of education young vampires received. Mira, a girl with long silver hair and eyes like frozen starlight, spoke first. Her voice was melodious, but carried an edge that made Elia's skin prickle. "So, you're the mortal everyone's talking about," she said, tilting her head with feline curiosity. "The one who dares to touch Aiden?" Elia met her gaze steadily. "I'm Elia, and yes, I help Aiden when he needs it." Cassius, dark-haired and sharp-featured, laughed softly. The sound held no warmth. "How quaint. Tell me, mortal, do you know what happens to humans who get too close to our kind?" "Cassius," Aden said quickly, but his voice lacked any real authority. Elelina didn't flinch. She had grown up in a rough neighborhood before moving to the village. She knew how to handle bullies, even supernatural ones. "I know that kindness doesn't require an invitation," she replied calmly. "And I know that Aden is hungry, so if you'll excuse me." She reached for Aden's spoon, but faster than her eye could follow. Darius was beside her, his hand closed around her wrist with human strength. Not quite painful, but definitely threatening. "Such bold words," he murmured, his breath cold against her ear. "But you're in our world now, little mortal. Different rules apply." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Elia felt the familiar spike of fear, but underneath it was something else. Anger. These children, for all their supernatural power, were picking on someone weaker than themselves. Some things never changed, no matter what species you were dealing with. "Let go of me," she said quietly. Darius's grip tightened slightly. "Or what? You'll call for help? You'll run crying to father?" "No," came a voice from the shadows, smooth as silk and sharp as a blade. "She won't need to." Kale emerged from the darkness between one heartbeat and the next. He didn't appear to move quickly, but suddenly he was there, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. Darius released Elia's wrist immediately and stepped back, his confident expression altering. "Father," Mira said, her voice suddenly much smaller. "We were just introducing ourselves." Lucian's red eyes swept over his children, and Elia saw them all flinch under his gaze. Even these young vampires, dangerous as they were, feared their sire. "Were you?" Kale said, his voice deceptively mild. "How thoughtful of you to welcome our guest. I trust you were extending every courtesy." The silence that followed was deafening. Elenina could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the fear that suddenly emanated from the young vampires despite their supernatural confidence. "Perhaps," Kale continued, moving to stand behind Aiden's chair, "you would prefer to continue your reunion elsewhere. I believe the library needs organizing." It wasn't a suggestion. Mira, Cases, and Darius filed out without another word, but not before each cast a look at Elia that promised this. Wasn't over? When they were gone, Lucian remained standing behind his son, one pale hand resting gently on Aiden's shoulder. "I apologize for their behavior," he said to Elenina. "They forget sometimes that power without purpose is merely cruelty." Elenina rubbed her wrist where Darius had grabbed her. "They're afraid," she said quietly. Both Aiden and Lucian looked at her with surprise. "Afraid?" Aiden asked. "Of what? They're stronger than either of us?" Elenina shook her head. "Not afraid of us. Afraid of losing you?" She looked up at Lucian. "They know, don't they, about Aiden's condition?" Something flickered in Lucian's eyes. "They know he is ill. They don't know the extent of it, but they can sense it." Elenina continued. "The change in family dynamics. You calling them home, bringing me here. They know something big is happening and they're lashing out because they feel powerless." Lucian studied her for a long moment. "You see much for a mortal." Elenina shrugged. "I've worked with kids before. Supernatural or not, they're still kids. They act out when they're scared." Aiden looked between them, confusion clear on his pale features. "What aren't you telling me?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Elenina looked at Lucian, seeing the weight of centuries in his ancient eyes. The burden of choices no parent should have to make. "That's south, not my place," she said gently. "But Aiden, whatever happens, know that you're loved. That's what matters." Aiden frowned, clearly sensing the undercurrents he couldn't quite grasp. But before he could ask more questions, Elenina was already reaching for his spoon. "Now, let us get some food in you before it gets cold." As she helped him eat, Elenina was acutely aware of Lucian's presence behind them. The Vampire King remained silent, but she could feel his gaze on her, weighing and measuring. She had passed some kind of test tonight, but she sensed there would be many more to come. Later, after Aiden had been helped back to his rooms and the diner had been cleaned, Elia walked the castle halls. She had expected to go straight to her chambers, but something drew her deeper into the maze of corridors. She found herself in what appeared to be a portrait gallery. Dozens of paintings lined the walls, depicting centuries of vampire nobility. But it was the most recent painting that stopped her cold. A woman with warm brown eyes and auburn hair smiled from an ornate golden frame. She was beautiful, but it was her expression that caught Elenina's attention. She looked at the viewer with such genuine warmth, such obvious love that it made Elenina's chest tight. "Aiden's mother," came Lucian's voice from behind her. Elenina didn't turn around. "She was beautiful. She was everything I thought I could never have," Lucian said quietly. "Mortal, yes, but so full of life that she seemed to burn brighter than the sun itself." Elenina heard the pain in his voice, centuries of regret and longing compressed into those few words. What was her name? Mira. The name was barely a whisper. She worked in the village at the bakery. I would go there sometimes in human form just to watch her work. She sang while she kneaded bread, laughed with the children who came to buy sweets. She made everything around her better just by existing. Evelina finally turned to face him. In the soft glow of the portraitess lighting, Cale looked less like a monster and more like what he truly was. A man who had loved and lost, who carried the weight of that loss every single day. How did she die? Cale's tightened. Childbirth, the mixing of our bloodlines. It was too much for her mortal body to bear. She lived long enough to hold Aiden once, to name him, to make me promise I would love him no matter what he became. Elia felt tears prick at her eyes. And you have I? Cale's laugh was bitter. I've protected him, provided for him. But love requires vulnerability, Miss Marchetti. It requires the ability to put another's needs before your own desires. And I am about to force my son to become something he was never meant to be because I cannot bear to lose him. The honesty in his voice was startling. Elia had expected many things from the Vampire King, but not this raw admission of failure. You're trying to save him, she said softly. I'm trying to save myself, Cale corrected. From the pain of watching him die. From the grief of losing the last piece of Mira I have left. The transformation will preserve his life, but it will kill everything that makes him her son. Elia stared up at the portrait, at Mira's loving smile, and felt something click into place. What if was another way? Cale went very still. What do you mean? Evelina turned to face him fully, her mind racing. You said the mixing of bloodlines is what's killing him. Human and vampire blood fighting each other in his system. Yes, but what if instead of purging one, you could balance them? What if you could strengthen the human side to match the vampire side? Cale's eyes narrowed. That's impossible. Mortal blood cannot be strengthened to match immortal power. Maybe not traditionally, Elia said, her excitement growing. But what if it wasn't about power? What if it was about harmony? She moved closer to him, no longer afraid. She had an idea, crazy as it sounded, and she needed him to understand. Aiden isn't dying because one side is weak, she continued. He is dying because they're at war, but tonight when your other children were here, did you notice anything different about him? Cale frowned, clearly following her logic, not yet seeing where she was going. He was calmer. Elia pressed on, more centered. Not because the vampire blood was stronger, but because the human blood was more at peace. When he feels loved, when he feels human connection, the conflict inside him eases. Understanding dawned slowly in Lucien's ancient eyes. You're suggesting that emotional stability could create physical balance. I'm suggesting that maybe Aiden doesn't need to choose between being human and being vampire. Maybe he needs to learn to be both. Lucien stared at her for a long moment, and Elia could practically see the centuries of experience wearing this new possibility in his mind. Even if such a thing were possible, he said finally, it would take time, months, perhaps years of careful nurturing. And there's no guarantee it would work. Elia nodded. But there's also no guarantee the transformation will leave any part of him intact that you'd recognize. At least this way, you'd be fighting for the son, not creating a stranger who happens to share his face. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Elia held her breath, waiting for his response. Finally, Cale spoke, his voice barely audible. If I agreed to try this path, if I postponed the transformation to attempt your theory, I would need more than hope to sustain me. What would you need? His red eyes met hers, and in them she saw not the vampire king, but a desperate father clinging to any chance of saving his child. I would need someone who could teach him to embrace both sides of his nature. Someone who could show him that being human isn't weakness, that love isn't liability. Elia's heart hammered against her ribs as she understood what he was asking. Someone like me? Yes. Cale stepped closer, his voice dropping to that hypnotic whisper she was beginning to recognize as his most dangerous tone. But understand what you would be committing to, Miss Marchetti. This would not be a temporary arrangement. If we're going to save Aiden, truly save him, it will require complete dedication, years of your life, your absolute loyalty. Evelina thought of it and smiled, of the way his eyes lit up when she helped him, of the boy who deserved a chance to be both human and vampire, both sides of his heritage to honor. And if I succeed, if Aiden learns to balance both natures. Kayla's smile was sharp as a blade, but for the first time since she met him, it held genuine warmth. If you succeed, Miss Hetty, you will have accomplished something that has never been done in the history of our kind. You will have created a bridge between two worlds. He paused, his gaze intensifying, and I will owe you a debt that can never be repaid. Elenina looked once more at Mira's portrait, at the woman who had loved a monster and died, bringing hope into the world. Then I guess we better get started. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not through force, but through the simple act of seeing someone for who they truly are. Elia's willingness to help a struggling boy changed everything. Not because she possessed any supernatural power, but because she chose compassion over fear. In that storm-swept castle, 3 lives converged around a moment of pure kindness. A dying boy caught between two worlds found someone who saw him as simply a child who needed help. A grieving father discovered that love wasn't about control or transformation, but about accepting and nurturing what already existed. And a waitress learned that sometimes the magic isn't in changing someone, but in helping them become fully themselves. The Vampire King had spent centuries believing that power meant having the ability to make the world according to his will. But Elia showed him something far more profound. That true strength lies in creating space for others to flourish exactly as they are. Aiden didn't need to be saved from his dual nature. He needed someone to teach him that being both human and vampire wasn't a curse to overcome, but a gift to embrace. This story reminds us that the most extraordinary changes often begin with the smallest acts of kindness. A meal shared, a hand extended, a moment of genuine care. These simple gestures can shift the course of entire destinies. In a world that often feels divided between light and darkness, Elia proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to see the humanity in others, regardless of what they are or where they come from. If the story moved you, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what act of kindness changed your life. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.